They came for him in the dead of night. Berkeley Castle lay cloaked in silence, its thick stone walls hiding the horror about to unfold. Inside a cold, dark cell, a man once called King of England lay shackled, filthy, weakened, broken. His name was Edward II. Once crowned with majesty, he was now a prisoner of disgrace. But the worst was still to come. Two men entered, carrying a medieval tool of unspeakable cruelty. They restrained him. A horn tube was forced into his body. Then, through it, a red-hot iron was inserted, searing his insides, while leaving no mark on the outside. His screams were muffled with pillows. By morning he was dead. The official cause? Natural causes. But there was nothing natural about what happened that night. This is the most famous version of Edward II's death. Shocking. Symbolic, gruesome, but is it the truth? For centuries, historians have debated what really happened in that dungeon. Was the method of murder chosen to reflect the king's rumored sins? Was it a political message wrapped in torture? Or perhaps, was it just a legend? And here's the twist. Some sources claim Edward wasn't murdered at all, that he escaped, lived in secret, and even wrote letters proving he survived. Is it possible the king vanished into history while a decoy took his place in the tomb? Why would a king be killed in such a horrifying way? Who ordered it? And, more disturbingly, is it possible that Edward didn't die that night at all? To uncover the truth, we must go back in time, to the birth of a prince who defied expectations, loved the wrong people, trusted the wrong allies, and paid the ultimate price. This is the real story behind one of England's most brutal royal deaths, and the mystery that still haunts history. Edward of Caernarfon was born on April 25, 1284, in a castle overlooking the rugged hills of Wales. The son of Edward I, called the Hammer of the Scots, he was born into iron expectations. His father was a towering figure of strength, strategy, and savagery, a king forged for conquest, but Edward II was different. Where his father took pleasure in war, the young prince found joy in rivers and fields. He rowed boats, dug in the dirt, repaired roofs with peasants, and practiced crafts with blacksmiths. He cared little for jousts or drills. He valued people for who they were, not what titles they held. To the rigid minds of the medieval court, this wasn't just odd, it was dangerous. His father was furious. Chronicles say Edward once yanked out his son's hair in a rage. The spark? Edward had begged to give a royal title, not to a general, not to a noble, but to a young Gascon knight, Piers Gaveston. The name Gaveston would become legend. Piers wasn't merely a companion. He was witty, elegant, bold, and most importantly, close. Too close. Whispers swirled through the court. Was it friendship or something more? Edward V didn't wait to find out. He banished Gaveston from England, but the bond had already been sealed. When Edward V died in 1307, the son he never trusted inherited the crown. He was 23, and his first royal act, bring Gaveston back, not in secret, not humbly. Edward made him Earl of Cornwall, showered him with lands, and most scandalously, allowed him to carry St. Edward's crown during the coronation. A sacred duty usually reserved for the highest of royals. The barons were enraged. This foreign-born upstart was no nobleman. To them he was a usurper of favor, a sign of weakness, even perversion. But Edward didn't care. In Gaveston he saw loyalty, laughter, and love. He saw someone who didn't judge him for being the prince who loved peasants and paddles more than politics and power. In this defiant act, Edward unknowingly lit the fuse that would burn down his own reign. Before the war, before the betrayal, before the dungeon, there was a love that dared to stand against a kingdom. Piers Gaveston wasn't just a court favorite, he was a lightning rod. When Edward II elevated him to Earl of Cornwall, the nobility saw red. It wasn't just envy, it was rage. This was a man with no royal blood, no land-based power, and no claim to prestige. Yet he had the king's ear, the king's gift, and maybe the king's heart. Contemporary chroniclers described their bond with words that shimmered with suggestion. Edward, they wrote, loved him beyond measure. They made a covenant of constancy, a phrase drenched in medieval romanticism. Was this the language of brotherhood? Or something more? Some say it was simply a deep chivalric friendship, the kind romanticized in medieval literature. But others, including later bishops and chroniclers, accused Edward of sodomy, a term loaded with moral and political weight in the 14th century. This wasn't merely a scandal, it was treasonous imagery, a symbol of a king unfit to rule. And Gaveston didn't help his cause. He was flamboyant, arrogant, and unafraid to mock the powerful. He gave insulting nicknames to the great earls, flaunted his influence, and dressed in rich silks that rivaled the king's own robes. He strutted through court with the confidence of a monarch, without a crown. As long as Edward protected him, he was untouchable, and that protection enraged the barons. In 1308, they forced Edward to exile Gaveston. It was a bitter blow, but only temporary. Gaveston returned, exiled again, then back again. The king's loyalty to him was unshakable, almost obsessive. By 1312, the nobility had enough. They captured Gaveston, imprisoned him, and without trial, executed him. He was stabbed and beheaded beside a lonely road. His head was displayed publicly as a warning not even a king could elevate love above law. Edward was shattered. He buried Gaveston with royal honors, surrounding his tomb with symbols of sainthood. But the message from the barons was clear: rule with us or fall alone. The death of Piers Gaveston marked a turning point. It wasn't just a personal loss, it was a political earthquake. The court saw a grieving king, his enemies saw an opening, and Edward would never recover. The death of Piers Gaveston didn't restore order. It shattered what little control Edward II had left. Grief-stricken, he withdrew from the nobility. But power abhors a vacuum. Into that space stepped two new faces, Hugh Despenser the elder and his son, Hugh the younger. And if Gaveston was resented, the Despensers were despised. Unlike Piers, who had charm and wit, the Despensers were ruthless. They used their proximity to Edward not for affection but for control. Through land seizures, rigged trials, and brutal punishments, they built a shadow empire, ruling through fear and turning the crown into a weapon. They weren't just favorites, they were tyrants in fine robes. While England's enemies gathered abroad, the Despensers made enemies at home. They crushed dissent, seized estates, and exiled or executed anyone who opposed them. Entire families were ruined, nobles whispered rebellion, but still, Edward protected them. Then came the ultimate humiliation, the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314. Edward marched to crush the Scots under Robert the Bruce. What followed was a military catastrophe. English forces were routed. The Scottish campaign his father once dominated ended in shame. Edward fled the battlefield in disgrace, and the nobility lost what little respect remained. Back in England, things only worsened. The treasury was dry, corruption was rampant, commoners starved while the Despensers grew rich, nobles who spoke out were punished, laws were twisted into weapons, justice was for sale. It was no longer a monarchy, it was a dictatorship in disguise. And then there was Queen Isabella. Once ignored, now quietly seething, Isabella watched her husband surrender the kingdom to parasites. She was publicly humiliated. Even the jewels she received as wedding gifts were taken and given to her rivals. She was treated as an ornament, not a queen. But Isabella was no passive victim. Behind closed doors, she began to scheme. Edward had no idea. By the early 1320s, the king's isolation was total. The barons loathed him, the people feared him, his own wife despised him. And all the while, Hugh Despenser the younger ruled unchecked, greedy, paranoid, and increasingly brutal. Edward clung to the throne, but it was already cracking beneath him. The seeds of rebellion had been sown. And this time, it wouldn't end with exile. It would end with betrayal, invasion, and blood. Isabella of France had once been a political bride, a child queen married at 12 to secure peace between England and France. At first she played her role quietly, dutiful, dignified, forgotten, but years of humiliation reshaped her. Edward's obsession with his favourites, first Gaveston, now the Despensers, had pushed her aside. He ignored her, insulted her, stripped her of power, and handed her belongings to her enemies. In public, she was the queen. In private, she was invisible. But Isabella wasn't weak. She was watching, learning, waiting. In 1325, she saw her chance. Edward sent her to France on a diplomatic mission. It was routine, expected. What he didn't expect was that Isabella would refuse to return. She remained in Paris, claiming she would not come back while the Despensers held power. In exile, she found an unexpected ally, Roger Mortimer. Once a respected English lord, Mortimer had been imprisoned in the Tower of London for opposing Edward, but he had escaped, fled to France, and nursed a burning hatred. When he met Isabella, their connection was instant, political and personal. Together they plotted. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer raised a small army, gathered support from exiled barons, and invaded England. It wasn't a grand force, but it didn't need to be. Edward had alienated nearly everyone. As Isabella's forces marched inland, the people welcomed her. Nobles defected, clergy offered blessings, castles surrendered without resistance. The queen, once dismissed as powerless, now looked like a savior of the realm. Edward panicked. He fled west with the Despensers, but his escape didn't last. The end came fast and brutally. Mortimer's forces captured the Despensers. Hugh the Elder was hanged. Hugh the Younger was given a punishment reserved for traitors. Dragged, hanged, disemboweled, castrated, and beheaded. His body was chopped into quarters, his head mounted on London Bridge. Edward's fall was complete. He was forced to abdicate in favour of his teenage son, Edward III. A king reduced to a prisoner, a ruler undone by his own wife. Isabella, the once ignored queen, now stood at the pinnacle of power. But her revenge was not yet complete. Edward still lived, and as long as he breathed, her rule and Mortimer's would never be secure. After the invasion, after the betrayal, after the blood, Edward II was no longer a king. In January 1327, under immense pressure from Parliament, the Church, and his own wife, he was forced to sign papers of abdication. His crown was passed to his 14-year-old son, Edward III, a boy too young to rule, a puppet in his mother's hands. Stripped of power and betrayed by those closest to him, Edward was first held in relative comfort. But soon, the mood changed. His captors didn't just want him dethroned, they wanted him erased. He was transferred to Berkeley Castle, a grim stone fortress nestled in the Gloucestershire countryside. It was here that Edward's world grew smaller, colder, darker. His new wardens, Thomas Berkeley, John Maltravers, and Thomas Gurney, carried out their orders with quiet cruelty. Edward's cell was kept filthy, his clothes removed, his meals spoiled. He was forced to ride without trousers, his skin rubbed raw by saddle sores. He was kept in isolation, mocked, and psychologically tormented. The goal wasn't just to contain him, it was to make him wish for death. But Edward didn't die. He endured. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. Despite everything, he held on. Word began to spread. Whispers of loyalists, rescue plans, conspiracies to restore the former king. And that's when everything changed. On the night of September 21st, 1327, the silence of Berkeley was shattered. According to the most infamous account, Edward's killers entered his cell carrying a horn tube and a red-hot iron. He was restrained. The tube inserted. The iron followed. A brutal method of execution designed to leave no outward marks, only unimaginable agony. By morning, he was dead. The official report? Natural causes. But few believed it. His face, it was said, was contorted. In agony. His corpse bore signs of trauma, and still, some whispered that Edward hadn't died at all. A letter surfaced in 1330, claiming Edward had escaped, that a porter's corpse was used as a decoy, that the fallen king had fled abroad, living in secret as a hermit. Fact or fiction, we may never know, but one truth remains. The king who once ruled England ended his days with no crown, no allies, and no justice, only shadow, and silence. The story of Edward II's death is one of the most gruesome in royal history, burned alive from the inside with a red-hot iron. But here's the question: did it actually happen? The first detailed account of the red-hot poker execution appeared over 2 decades after Edward's supposed death. Chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, writing around 1350, described the method in lurid detail. The horn inserted to shield the skin, the iron slid in to destroy his insides, and the muffled screams so that no marks would betray the murder. It's unforgettable, symbolic, and suspicious. Many historians now question this version of events. There are no contemporary reports from 1327 that describe such a method. No eyewitness testimony, no physical evidence, so why has this narrative endured? Because it was powerful. The red-hot iron wasn't just torture, it was a political message, a grotesque punishment meant to mirror the king's alleged sins. Edward's sexuality had long been a point of controversy. If the rumors of his relationships with men were true, the murder method wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The message? This is what happens to kings who defy nature, religion, and the order of the realm. But what if it was all propaganda? Edward III, who eventually overthrew Mortimer and imprisoned his mother Isabella, may have had political motives to exaggerate his father's suffering. By painting Mortimer and Isabella as monstrous murderers, he justified his own coup. The more brutal the story, the more righteous the revenge. And there's the Fieschi letter. In 1330, a mysterious letter surfaced, written by an Italian priest named Manuele Fieschi. In it, he claimed to have heard the confession of Edward II, alive and living in exile. According to the letter, Edward had escaped Berkeley Castle with the help of allies. A dead body, possibly a porter's, was used as a decoy. Edward fled to Europe, travelled through Germany and France, and eventually became a hermit in northern Italy. The letter was delivered directly to Edward III. Why? That's still debated. Some scholars believe the letter is genuine, pointing to specific details only an insider could know, like the way Edward travelled, the clothes he wore, and the exact path of his escape. Others dismiss it as an elaborate hoax designed to blackmail or manipulate the crown. But even skeptics admit the story is oddly persistent. Years later, in 1338, a man appeared in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor claiming to be Edward II. He spoke fluent English, knew court customs, looked the part. Was it really him, or just an impostor? We may never know the truth. But whether Edward died in agony at Berkeley or lived on in the shadows, his fate remains one of the most chilling and debated mysteries in royal history. Edward II's life was defined by contradiction. A king with absolute power who lost everything, a monarch born to rule, undone by love, loyalty, and betrayal. His death, whether by brutal murder or lonely exile, became more than just a historical footnote. It became a myth, a warning, a story told for centuries in hushed tones and darkened theatres. His tomb in Gloucester Cathedral still draws curious visitors. There, carved in cold alabaster, lies a serene, regal effigy. No sign of pain, no hint of screams, just a peaceful image of a king who, according to legend, died in unimaginable agony. That contrast, the calm stone above and the horror beneath, is Edward's legacy. A man remembered not for his laws or conquests, but for the way he died, or didn't. His fall changed history. It proved that even kings could be removed. It paved the way for future depositions, rebellions, and questions about royal authority. And it left us with a mystery that may never be solved. If you found Edward's tragic story as haunting as we did, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more forgotten tales from history, and let us know in the comments, what do you think really happened to Edward II?